And welcome to another episode of Unpacking Endpoint Management with Danny and Steve. I am Steve Thomas. I'm a senior program manager at Microsoft. And here I am with Danny Guillory, who is also a senior program manager at Microsoft on the config manager team. And we have a very special guest, a very anticipated guest, one that is going to come and talk about something that many of our listeners have been wanting and watchers have been wanting to talk about for several months now. The MEM settings catalog, the brand new settings catalog for Endpoint Manager. Now, our special guest today is Mike Danoski. Mike, give an introduction.
Hey, up, everybody. How's it going? Thanks for having me on. I'm also a senior program manager in MEM. Wasn't always that way. I've been at Microsoft for probably 9 years or so now, working across really client management, but kind of on a weird path, going from Active Directory as a support engineer over to the late great Windows Phone. And then Windows Phone, of course, some people may not say late, some people still trying to use it and keep it alive. But going from there over to Intune, right? Enterprise management scenarios on Windows Phone naturally leads to Intune. I was over there in support for a while and then worked my way over running some of the teams that help build some of the support tools and work and take customer escalations up into our engineering team. And 2 years ago or so, maybe a year and a half ago, losing track of time, you know how it is, moved over to the feature team working on device configuration. Yeah, that's the short one, right?
Mike, I've always loved following your career because we have very similar trajectories. I too started out as a support engineer. The very first thing I was working on was cluster, the Microsoft Windows NT4 and 2000 cluster services. And then I moved to another niche product, SoftGrid, AppV, and did a lot of work with that. And then before coming over to the config manager and Intune teams as well. But now I never got to work on Windows Phone, and so I am jealous of that. But nonetheless, it's fascinating, watching all of our careers and watching us do many different things here. And
I'm more surprised that you admitted that.
Hey, I still have my Zoom, and I'm.
Oh.
Yes.
Now you're showing your age.
Yeah. They'll take my Zune for my cold dead hand. Yeah.
Have a Zune and a Windows Phone within arm's reach if needed. I can back you in the bookcase.
Okay, nobody wants to hear that probably. So
yeah,
let's get right down to business here with the settings catalog. So what's the latest with the settings catalog, Mike?
Yeah, so if you recall, back in February, we launched the settings catalog. It's been years in the making. And today we could probably talk a little bit more about where the settings catalog will be going and kind of the spirit behind the settings catalog and sort of our changes that we're making in device config and endpoint security moving forward. I can show a couple demos as well. Settings catalog is still in public preview, and I think we'll get some questions about that in the QA. And there's also some things that have been shaking up more recently in the settings catalog. We continuously add new settings, and I can talk a little bit more about how we add settings in our testing process and stuff like that, and sort of how it's changed from even just a year ago. And really, we just added, as you may know, if you're checking the blog space and things like that, maybe the number is somewhere between 1,400 and 1,700 classically ADMX GPO settings that Windows has added for support with MDM. Then they're getting backported, and so that's all going on right now. It's all very fresh.
In fact, my colleague John Callahan posted on Twitter the link to the preview that came out September 1st for the KB of the backport for those customers who are on Windows 10 2004 and 20H2 as well. Yeah, we kind of buried the lead there, but in fact, I'll paste that link in chat while I'm thinking about it.
Great, excellent, thank you. Yeah, so that's, I think it's 5101 is the KB, but that'll, from what I hear, I am not a Windows servicing expert, despite what folks may think. I think it comes out next Tuesday in the all up update. think.
So Dano, tell us a little bit more about these 1,400 settings that are coming in. Like, what drove that? Like, what was the story behind that? Like, did you just wake up one day and was like, let me just dump more stuff in the settings catalog. Let me make it more. Like,
So
give us some of that creation stuff.
where does it come from? Okay, so I joined the device config PM team in January of 2020. It's right before everyone went home. And so the project that I sort of inherited and started to run with was this idea that we needed a better way to add settings, and we needed a better way to add settings quickly in a way that we can unlock tons of settings. If you've been with us for a while, and by us, the royal us of Intune and MEM, you'll know that when we first came out, there were like dozens of settings, and that was it. And what drove that is Windows over time, and it's really came out with like 8.0. People will argue Windows Mobile 6.5 had like tons of management capabilities, but we're not going to go there. So with Windows 8, mostly Windows 8.1, which is more enterprise focused, we saw the change over to MDM. And so Windows made the decision, hey, instead of relying on GPO, which requires line of sight to your domain controller, everything has to be on-prem, or you're doing VPN or something like that, just to get policy, that if we invested in this concept of mobile device management using sort of the Open Mobile Alliance standards and all this stuff, that we could build something that works in the cloud world. And people were at the time were bringing, mobile devices were getting email for the first time, and EAS by itself just wasn't cutting it. Fast forward to when I joined the team, and one of the first things I had to do was add 3 settings. It took about 2 to 3 months just to add those 3 settings. They're relatively complex, but it was a mapping exercise and a designing exercise and making sure we get the setting correctly, and it's based on research. So there were times where, we think that if we say yes, it means this value, and there's a lot of mapping going on. And you might see that in some of the stuff that existed before settings catalog, where there's some mapping, where the CSP or client or configuration service provider in Windows might have options 1, 2, 3, and we try to simplify it and say like enable BitLocker yes, or something like that. And so what we've done, and I'm sure you guys have seen the same with sort of like where we were. I don't know if you have any more like sort of flavor to add to some of the experience that you have with trying to, map some of those things out and figure out what does what. The thing I hear a lot is like there's 5 places to turn on BitLocker, and they all have different names, they have different values and stuff like that. So really the 3 goals of all the work we were doing is make it easier to add new settings in a very fast way. And then make sure that we sort of true everything up. If it was based on research in the past, what we do for all of our new settings backend is it's based directly on Windows code. So we get a definition file out from the Windows team for each configuration service provider that tells us all the settings that are available, all the different values, what machines it's applicable on. So we now have more intelligent settings as well. Fast forward a little bit to February, and we decided, we've rebuilt this settings framework from the ground up. Everything is 100% accurate. We had 2 bodies of research. One that says that if you give someone like an action phrase, like turn on BitLocker, yes, no, it's much more easy to understand. We had another piece of research that said the further away we go from exactly what is specified in the Windows setting, the more confusing it is. So we went with the latter approach, and so what you'll see in the settings catalog is a 1-to-1 map to everything that's in the CSP. There's a couple places where we change it, maybe some out-of-date branding names for some of the categories that you see in settings catalog, but really we like to leave it just as is. We pull all the settings in, we test everything, make sure that it works, make sure that it writes to a device. There's still a couple settings that we're still working on, trying to figure out. Maybe reporting isn't quite where we'd like it to be for that setting for one reason or another. We're still working on adding some of the CSP based settings and still approving those through. So it's been a busy 2 years, right? It feels like a lot longer, but yeah.
Between that and policy analytics, yeah, there's been a lot going on in the policy space. I imagine you probably have to do some policy rationalization too, where you probably came across things like we really don't need to bring the entire catalog that includes things like Microsoft Comic Chat and NetMeeting and stuff like that, obviously. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, because really my team, the team that I work on, my peers own policy analytics. We own endpoint security. We own baselines as well, and it really folds the whole story of a customer comes in and says, "Hey, we'd like to," an administrator says, "We'd like to deploy Intune," and the next question is, "Well, where would you like to start?" If you've got legacy on-prem GPO stuff you'd like to bring forward, your best bet is probably to use policy analytics, and we have I think it's out. Maybe we don't. So there's a migrate, a plan to have a migrate button or a migrate button. I haven't been keeping up with the preview. Yeah, breaking news. No, just so migrating that into a policy, and really evaluating that and thinking about it. I'm working with customers directly where they'll bring in thousands of GPOs, tens of thousands of GPOs, where we rationalize that down to a per setting level, and then maybe provide some guidance or recommendation on some of those. Like, if you are telling me you'd like to bring something forward into MDM that doesn't quite make sense, what I'd like to be able to do is give you some recommendation to say, hey, that's a great setting for something that's on-prem. Maybe the setting, like there's a few that we just added where they determine like how a client communicates with a domain controller, which if you're thinking cloud only, don't bring it along. But if there's a customer who's stuck, maybe they're hybrid Azure AD join and they want to move off of GPO, we don't want to really just want to make sure that if you need a setting, if you absolutely need a setting, if your security team says, hey, if without this setting we're not going cloud, we want to make sure that it's there. And I think with this backport and all the new settings that have been added, we're constantly updating the mapping, right, in policy analytics. So you'll see those percentages go up. You'll see more and more things supported. And then moving forward as well, we're trying to figure out ways where if there is something that's unsupported or deprecated, we can give you some guidance. Another one I've seen a lot of is like old Office policy. And from my understanding is like newer Office policy will take over. So if you deploy Office 2016 ADMX, it'll take over for older versions as well. So yeah, you're spot on. That group, the policy analytics has been a huge growing space. But then the other side of it too, right? If you don't really know where to start and you don't have GPO or you're starting fresh from the cloud, the other answer is go use baselines, right? Go start with baselines and start deploying those out, because that's really our like basic security recommendations to get you going.
Right. I mean, it's the great thing about baselines. I use food analogies. Baseline is like it's like a plated or HelloFresh, where everything is laid out for you. It's very simple, and if you stick to the plan, you're in great shape. Whereas the settings catalog is a la carte. It's a buffet.
Yeah.
But you don't have to eat everything at the buffet.
Yeah.
Thousands of options there. Yeah, Mike. Sometimes my jokes don't land.
No, it does. Where my brain was going was I don't know how there's a certain restaurant that I know that has like a 30-page menu. It's that. Don't order everything. Not everything's great. There's stuff you never want to order, but if you're there with a group of 20 people, everyone's got what they need. So, but then baseline is, like you said, the prefix 7-course, where like you pick one thing back and forth. Maybe you say, hey, you know what, I don't want to, I want to pass on the cake today or something like that. I don't know who would do that, but yeah, I'm totally with you. And that's so that actually brings us forward to where we're going with settings moving forward. And I brought one slide. Danny asked that I brought a slide, so I brought one slide. I can share my screen if that works.
Yep.
I think it should work.
There you go. All yours. You're on the big screen.
Can I oops.
Dana, you should be on the big screen.
I'm here. Hey.
Yep.
Make sure that I share the right one.
That helps.
That does help.
Yep.
Okay. And I think that's working.
I see it. Looks perfect.
Stuff's moving around. That's a good sign.
Let me send it to the screen.
So this is just a diagram that I've been using. If you've used policy in the past, you'll notice that there's a ton of different graph endpoints. Everything in Ibiza, everything in Azure, in MEM, in the MEM admin console, or MEMAC, runs on graph. And if you've messed around with migrating policy, creating anything outside of what's in the UX, you'll notice that there's tons of different graph endpoints. And I think the mental model before that you had to have was you needed to know, oh, BitLocker settings are in device restrictions, but if I'm looking for this other setting, that's actually in this other profile, and Hello for Business is here, and this other thing's over in endpoint protection, and oh, now I got to go over to endpoint security because this setting's over here. And the key part there on the decision was, where's the setting exist? And moving forward, what we'd like to do is, now we have all these settings that we've built up in the settings catalog, going back and changing the policy experience. So there's really 3 ways to make a policy. You can either start with the settings catalog and build whatever you want. You can add whatever you want in there. You can have your baseline or benchmark with hundreds of settings, or you could just grab one setting. You know, you pick up, you log on one day as an IT admin, and someone goes, hey, do we have the setting turned on? And you go, no, we got to go turn it on now. Head over, create one policy, send it out, target it correctly. So you can build whatever you want. You can order whatever you like off the 33-page menu with 700 options for cheesecake. It's not naming any names. I'm just calling it like it is. So the other thing that we're looking to build then is, now that we have all of these universal settings, is policy templates. So you'll see what we had before fits the mold of what a template is. It's a group of settings that stick together. They make sense to enable at the same time, but we might not necessarily have recommendations. So they're based on a collection of settings. Maybe it's a scenario. Some of them probably won't make sense as we move forward. So we'll be figuring out how to turn some of those things like device restrictions into a settings catalog policy. And then baselines, like you just said, right? Start with recommendations. These don't necessarily have to be security baselines. So I'm looking for maybe some feedback that folks have on some baselines that would work. We're looking at, other Windows features where it's just, maybe you just want the recommendation. Like, you don't need every little customized setting turned on. You just want the baseline recommendation of, hey, here's how I get this feature up and running. I know the update for business people, and some people will have, or teams will have built their own baselines, but it lives in documentation, right? So it's some of the security baselines that folks have, or like the Windows Update for Business has a baseline that's just in document form now. So we're looking at ways that we can make that a little more easier to deploy for folks. But again, the folks who've worked with Graph before will rejoice that everything just creates the same policy. I can talk a little bit more about that policy part. But yeah, all the settings are data driven, they're intelligent. You might have seen this with our backport. So this is in the Q&A, so maybe I'll hold off on this topic exactly. Or it's from the Q&A from Twitter earlier. Someone was asking about some settings or their policy stopped applying last week or the week before. We can talk about that a little bit. The settings catalog, one of our other goals is making sure that we have 0-day support. So we work with Edge, Office, OneDrive, who have ADMX policy, work with Windows, it's constantly creating new settings. Security teams are always popping out new settings. You've seen the Print Nightmare settings that came out with KB, I think 5101 as well. Same one's used for those new settings for point and print, and as well as backporting those settings as well. That's also the one that has those 1400 to 1700 GPO based on customer feedback. That list really came from policy analytics. And so these universal settings are powering all of our scenarios.
Cool.
Yeah, so that's the plan.
I guess top of mind thing comes from me is,
yeah,
when do we use templates versus settings catalog? Because that is a pretty common question from a ton of customers. I mean, I'm sure you talked till you're blue in the face about it also, but give us some guidance there.
Yeah, so templates today are sort of what we had that existed before. A lot of the groups of settings together. Some of them might be catch-alls, but there will be templates that we'll come up with. Like I think the one that I really like is the Surface Hub template that has a lot of just the settings that you want for Surface Hub. So say that you purchase Surface Hub and you go, hey, where do I start? This thing has slightly different configuration. You'll have a template that sort of brings all those settings together instead of trying to go hunt through the settings catalog and make sure that you have full coverage. Everything in endpoint security would also be considered a template. So you've got your firewall policy, your disk encryption, all that good stuff, EDR, all of your attack surface reduction, ASR type rules, all of that stuff going in, because that's really where we get to the point where in endpoint security versus DC, I can talk a little about that too, because that's the other one where people go, hey, which one do I use going forward and stuff like that. But really the template is more scenario focused to make sure we can say it's a little more curated. It's not quite the prefix menu, but it's not the 33-page menu. And so with policy templates, you can have a little bit more of a guided scenario, a guided experience, rather than just sort of getting dropped in the ocean of the settings catalog or saying like, here's your baseline, here's your recommendations, this is what you must use.
I agree,
yeah.
Mike. I've seen with customers that a lot of them, especially customers who are new to not just Intune, but new to the cloud, they've gotten these specialized devices. They have these specialized workloads, and they realize that, okay, these only come with modern management. So they like the template idea. They like the fact that they can be guided through a simple process of managing up these specialized workload devices. You mentioned Hub. That's a big one there. Yep.
Yeah, the other one that you just reminded me of is like Kiosk, right? Like Kiosk is a template because that thing needs a bunch of different settings all set at the same time. It all generates some giant XML on the back end that gets sent down to the device. So that's a really good one to have as a template moving forward, because if you had to pick, as someone who's handwritten assigned access XML, you'll mess up if you try and build it piece by piece, because one missing setting that's required, the whole thing's not going to write. You're going to get reporting errors back. It's not fun. So making sure that those things that are more created experiences. Another great example, I don't know how I overlooked this, is Wi-Fi profiles, email profiles, VPN profiles, certificate profiles. Those will all remain in templates, because having like going into settings catalog and picking like a Wi-Fi SSID by itself isn't going to do anything for you. So having all of those settings grouped together is really what we think is the best experience in order to do those. Also things that are instanced, right? Where you can create multiple ones and deploy them down to a device without creating conflict. So like, again, your VPN profiles, your Wi-Fi profiles, where you're going to want to configure like multiple ones at the same time. And then you can always use policy sets. I think we have policy sets support coming very soon for settings catalog. So you can drop all your policies together in a policy set and handle all of your assignments all at once. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I wanted to touch on is endpoint security versus device config, because people say, which one do I go to? The endpoint security area was really built around saying we want to build an area for the security admin persona, where you could provision rights to someone who's a security professional who isn't a client management or device management or deployment or imaging or endpoint specialist. They can be focused on security, and everything there is going to speak the language that they understand, as far as being based on a lot of the security products. Targeting runs the same, and everything sort of, other than where it shows up, the policies will live sort of in the same area and get smooshed together to get sent down to devices when that device goes and checks in. I think we did a lot of investment in endpoint security, and now we're going to bring some of that goodness back into device configuration. So it's not an or, but more so like it's a endpoint security will be a subset of what's available on device configuration where it makes sense. So we'll be bringing some of those things back. You may see some security templates showing up in device config over the next year or so. We'll also be, as we the beautiful thing about working on this team and Microsoft as a whole, as you see moving forward, is we're incredibly customer focused. So if people come back and they're like, no, we don't want to see any of that, leave it over there, keep it totally separated, or we start coming out with some things, that's where we can sort of pivot and maybe we build some more controls where people can customize what their experience is and stuff like that. But we're sort of at the beginning of a road with everything coming into built off this new policy backend. Everything just creating a policy. The other beautiful thing about it is not configured. I don't know if you guys have seen how we handle not configured these days.
Try the trilateral situation. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we can do so in the settings catalog, it's what you see is what you get. If you add something in, it's configured. If you remove it out, it's not configured. We'll send the remove down to the device. In templates, what we've done is since everything's dynamic and everything's data driven, we've built custom controls where if it was a switch before, it's now a drop down with not configured. If it was a string entry, you now have another toggle to say configured, not configured, so that you can see all your settings all in one place in your template or baseline. What that really does is, back in the day, what would happen is we'd save the state for every setting that you have in your policy. So if you have 17 knobs and you turn one on, we'd save 17 states with just the one turned on and the other 16 in not configured. Sometimes this can create some issues as we're sort of looking to hold just what you intend to deploy. And sometimes there could be some conflict and things like this, and there were some growing pains as we were working out some of those kinks. In this new approach, what we do is if it's set to not configured or it's not in your settings catalog policy, we don't save any notion of it. So our policy object, if you interact with the graph side of it, only contains those settings that you want to be in that policy, and they each are the same setting that you have in a baseline is going to have the same ID as what you're going to have in a settings catalog policy. So they're one-to-one.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We have a few questions that have shown up in the chat, and the very first one, I could have almost predicted this question. Are there any plans to add additional items like group policy preferences?
So right now we are working. I work very closely with the Windows team. We gather a lot of customer feedback, especially with group policy analytics, because the number one thing that comes back, well, maybe not the number one thing, a thing that comes back a lot is group policy preferences, and people say, how do I do this moving forward? How do I map a drive in MDM? How do I do reg key manipulation? How do I do all that kind of stuff? So we're in the feedback gathering phase where we are crossing that with alarm. It's early.
Time Mike really gets up.
I hope that wasn't the alarm for the show, because you would have been about 30 minutes late.
No, that was the everyday alarm. So yeah, we GPP. Oh, that was convenient, wasn't it? No, that's all I have to say about GPP. No.
I'll just set up. He did that on purpose.
So we're working and rationalizing between what makes sense in the cloud. If something really is a powerful scenario that we want to do in the cloud, we should build a CSP for it, right? Instead of opening up like a big GPP framework for people to do custom GPP. Now, the one thing I will say is start thinking about ADMX, building out and deploying out custom ADMX as a way to do reg keys outside of system and for applications, because that's something that we're looking at and something that we're talking to Windows about. Through MDM, of course, you can do an ADMX install. It's what we do for Edge, OneDrive, and Office. If you've done it through the custom OMA path in Intune already, I don't have news I can share yet, but I'm looking at making that way better. So you don't have to do custom OMA in order to deploy ADMX. What's up, Danny?
That question.
Yeah.
I would expect you to ask me a tough question too, so kind of tough. But is there why would I deploy ADMX versus settings catalog, EDF, anything. What's the value there? Like, I don't know. Somebody that has another environment outside of Microsoft too. There's a bunch of ADMX. Sure, customers have a bunch of ADMX. Hey, this setting doesn't exist, so they go create their own. What's going on with ADMX?
What's going on with ADMX? You broke up a little bit. Are you saying custom ADMX or ADMX in general, or what you have at GPO?
ADMXs,
Yeah, so today what you can do is you can upload and install an ADMX and then configure it through custom OMA URI. I want to make that better so that folks can take your example of whatever, insert big company name here where you have your own ADMX, whether it's for something that's from the ISVs, right? Because we're constantly thinking about how do we become more extensible. We've been extensible with adding everything in from Windows and backporting ADMX settings, but how do we, extend that? Today, our extensibility story is custom OMA URI, which is kind of a catch-all, but it's not great. Once something goes in there, we don't know what it is. From the Intune side, when I say we, I mean Intune. So we don't know exactly what it is. So if that thing needs to do an install first and then go do like a file comparison, and it could really do well with some good intelligence, some of the stuff we already have in our ADMX templates, administrative templates, then yeah, we want to light something up for that third party scenario. The other thing I'll say, right, because for administrative templates, so we came up with administrative templates is before my time on the team, but I think it was about 3.5 years ago, and with it might even be 4 by now. Trying to think. I track my time by what building I was in at Microsoft.
Yeah.
And so this past 1.5 years has just been
Blur.
Been tough for me.
Yeah.
Like I'm like, were we in building 40 when that came out? Because that means it's, and I'm trying to reverse math and yeah. So not good. So when administrative templates came out, that was like sort of our first data-driven settings experience where everything was built off of Windows ADMX, and then there was Edge and Office and OneDrive in there. I'm talking to some other internal teams from the Microsoft side to get some more settings in there. But what you'll see long term, it's not going to be this year, is us figuring out how to shrink those two experiences just into settings catalog. Templates can already call from administrative templates and ADMX backed settings, as can baselines. So just getting everything into settings catalog. Some of the feedback I got right now is we're a little behind on some of the settings for Edge in the catalog, but they're definitely available in administrative templates. Administrative templates is still working. It's doing great. We're still investing in the area for now, but we want to shrink those experiences together and make sure that when we do that, all the goodness that we put into administrative templates lives on in settings catalog. All the rich reporting and the way we handle ADMX install is really slick. From a technology standpoint on our side, because it's pretty complex. We had a big issue, and I think it's fixed. I think it's fixed now. If it's not, the fix is on its way. Folks have been asking how to do monthly enterprise channel for Office. The way the ADMX changed, it was difficult for us to revise the way that was going to work, because once you install an ADMX, you can't install on top of it. The way that CSP was built. There's a KB that allows us to do a replace. It's pretty well saturated at this point. So we're working on a way where you can have both versions of that setting. You can, if you want to use the one that has monthly enterprise channel, you can use it. If you don't, you can continue using the one you have. But we put a lot of investment in that space, and we want to carry that over into settings catalog. If you're starting fresh and the setting you have is there in settings catalog, go ahead and use it. If you have administrative templates today, don't worry about going and like trying to move those over to settings catalog or anything like that unless you want to, right? I'm not going to tell you not to do that. The one thing that I would say move over to settings catalog if you can is your custom OMA stuff, like your custom OMA. If you're deploying some setting that was never previously available in Intune through a custom OMA profile, you certainly move that over to settings catalog. You'll get better reporting, and if there's any special applicability behind it or any special behavior that's required for that setting, you'll get that in the catalog more than just using a custom profile. That's my long answer to group policy preference.
No, that's awesome. Another question we had: are there plans to create a mechanism to help migrate the other Intune profile types over into a settings catalog profile?
Once we have a replacement for what's there today, we'll be providing the tools necessary to move you over if you'd like to evaluate or test it yourself, or sort of like pre-hydrate a policy. So if you have something that we're going to be moving over, if you want to do it yourself. Otherwise, my goal is that if I meet them every year, or used to meet them every year at Ignite, the admin that logs into MEM once a year, or once every other year. If you're that admin, and you found yourself here somehow, worry not. We'll take care of things for you. There's no action required. It's just going to be a matter of time. If you're the kind of admin who wants to get ahead of it and say, actually, I like the settings catalog more because it lets me combine these things in a certain way, or I like the reporting better, or something like that, by all means, you can do it. We will, if you wait, we'll have a mapping at some point that I want to make sure that we somehow get out to folks, so that we can say, hey, if this is your device restrictions thing before, here's what it looks like in settings catalog, or more quickly would be like, here's your policy and endpoint security today, here's what it looks like in settings catalog. Well, not settings catalog directly, but in a template.
Gotcha.
The other thing, because that actually sparks another thing, is now that everything is sort of on a universal playing field, everything's all speaking the same language, it makes sense to do some of the obvious policy management improvements, like duplicate, import, export, that actually import and exports the policy itself with all the switches, instead of just like I think the export button now, if you click on device config, just gives you a list of all the settings. Baselines has a feature where you can pop out, if you have a compare, you can see per setting, but bringing that in first party just makes sense. And then seeing where we can go from there based on all of the new functionality that we have now that everything's sort of written off the same universal backend.
Excellent. Another question we got: what's the best way to troubleshoot endpoint policy application? In GPO land, we have RSOP, resultant set of policy. Is there any good way to check settings applicability from Intune?
There's a few different ways, and this is actually a good point. I've been hearing rumblings lately that when we backported the applicability, so every setting that we have in settings catalog has an applicability map that says this is the min version and max version. Yep. All the stuff that was Windows Insiders basically had a minimum version of the Windows Insiders build. When we go through and compute policy, what happens is we will compute that, and if the device checking in is in an Insiders build, we won't deploy the setting. We'll list it as not applicable. You see that in reporting. We went through and remapped some of our applicability, and I'm hearing from customers that this looks like that the policy is no longer applying. And I think what it is it's a reporting hiccup. I need to go check with my team and see what's actually happening, but that's what it kind of seems like to me. I moved to Washington in 2015. So between 2015 and 2020, I was troubleshooting Intune stuff. And learning, and then what that did was it really helped helped me learn sort of the end-to-end flow of how policy works, and that's kind of one of the areas I focused on. We have a lot of support tools internally that we've written that help with sort of rationalizing this and figuring it out. So we start with making sure that the basic stuff is covered, and if you call support, they now have troubleshooting tools which will tell them, like, hey, this is what we have diagnostics that we built into some of the support tools, as well as, right, there's a new support experience. And if you use the support experience, we'll even run some diagnostics, make sure that your account has an Intune license, make sure that your user is licensed, right? So if you say this user's not enrolling, I think we can prompt you for a user ID and say, hey, actually, this user isn't licensed. Check that basic stuff first. If you're just getting started out, right? Like if you're steady state and you've been using Intune for 5 years, that's obviously not going to be your first step. Make sure that the device is healthy. If we're getting nitty gritty, my way to always check if a device is healthy is client registration status equals 2 on the graph side. What that means is make sure that it says registered, make sure that it shows up in your device list. You can go into, I think it's hardware, click on the device and click on hardware in the MEM portal. Also make sure you're looking at MEM devices. We get some people who get stuck looking at Azure Active Directory device records and things like that, which doesn't necessarily mean the device is enrolled. If you see it in the MEM device list, then I'm trying to think if there's a reason why we wouldn't have enrolled devices in there, but it pretty much means it's enrolled unless it's a stale record or something like that. And making sure the device is healthy, making sure that the policy is targeted correctly. Right now, that's a little difficult in settings catalog. The way I usually would do that is I look to see that the policy says pending. Right now, we are catching up, and it's one of the reasons why settings catalog still has a preview tag is we don't have pending state. I think adding pending state is super critical to making sure that you can sort of see that you've done your targeting correctly, because that's what I do, right? I'll create a policy, I'll assign it to a group. I have a group called Literally Everyone, so I know I'm not messing it up. It's literally called Literally Everyone. I'll deploy it to Literally Everyone, and then I'll go in and click on that policy and see that device list and make sure I see everything pending. Or I'll go to the device and I'll click on device configuration and make sure that I see that new profile sitting there as pending. Right now, that's not there in settings catalog. It's something we're working on. We're pretty close. You'll see it. Soon is different for different kinds of folks, but you'll see it relatively soon. So yeah, that is probably where I would go from there to make sure that it's working, and that's all service side still. We're not even device side yet. Device side, run the MDM diag, do a control F, look for the setting you're looking for. There's a whole lot of provisioning package stuff in there. And there's a CSP called knobs that allows OEMs to change the user experience. You'll see those in the MDM diag as well. You'll see when you open up an MDM diag, there'll say provider ID. The one that's all caps is Intune. And I think it says MDM, and you might have a few, but if you also search for that provider ID, you'll see all the entries that it's made. There's places in the registry you can go look to make sure. I can maybe pop the maybe a follow up from this. Does that work? I don't know how you guys handle follow ups. Can I follow up with some reg key pass where you can see what the current CSPs that are turned on through Policy Manager are? I think this is all Policy CSP too. There's other places you have to look for some of the other CSPs. You can look at the registry, see what's set. You can see the current, you can see the default values. You can see there's actually a node cache where you can see every command that came down over MDM, and they're like indexed. So you can search that to see if something's coming down. And that's just to see if a policy, like if you're not sure if a policy is hitting a device. Obviously hitting sync is a great move. Every time you hit sync, we take everything that's available for that device and send it down and check. So it's not like when you hit sync, we're only going to check like your latest changes or something like that. We take all of the policy assigned to that user and device combo and smush it together and in an XML or syncML and send it down to the device every time. If something's in a bad state, that's another question. It's something we get a question about a lot. Like if I have a Wi-Fi profile that's not working correctly or something like that, how do I remove it and add it back? That's something we're thinking about and trying to figure out what scenarios there are that we need to go and cover for that. Because I don't think it's every setting. It's from what I'm hearing, it's more so those instance settings like Wi-Fi, resource access, firewall rules, that kind of stuff.
Here's an interesting question. I've actually gotten this before by the many customers who in the past adopted the AGPM product, and one of the things like what they really liked about it was the change control and revision history. And so the question is, change control and revision history with configuration profiles would be a great addition. Being able to roll back to a previous revision or require approval for deployment. So that's really not a question. That's more of a request.
That's
I'll plus one that one because
fair request, and I may have some stuff floating around. You know, that could address that at some point. So definitely something we're looking at. We have the information. We have it for baselines, right? You can't go back, but the forward version compare, being able to compare baseline 1 to baseline 2 versus your customizations and stuff like that. So something we're looking at. I don't have anything to share yet, but AGPM is a treasure trove of good management capabilities, as far as like, hey, these are some places where we can look for some inspiration on, what are some other things that people are used to using for policy management, and how would we, what would that look like in the cloud and stuff like that.
Also, we had of all things, troubleshooting tools for autopilot question, which I will answer with a shameless plug to go back and watch the last episode of Unpacking Endpoint Management, as there was a lot of discussion and topics on that. So here's an interesting question that's using BitLocker as an example, but in some cases with things like BitLocker, you can configure them from like 4 places, and some of the settings will overlap. Endpoint security, settings catalog, templates, and baseline. What is the best way to approach that or manage that?
So BitLocker specifically, if I had to turn on BitLocker today, I'd go to endpoint security and use the template that's there under disk encryption. I think we have a file vault profile and a BitLocker profile. That's the best way to make sure that you're getting all the settings together in one spot. BitLocker notoriously, from working from support, I know that it's easy to misconfigure. Folks will like require a pin, but then also require no pin, which will cause unsupported behavior and weirdness. And so the template really puts everything together. If you have BitLocker deployed in another policy and there's some new setting that you want to add in, you can use settings catalog on the side. The way we compute policy is we take all of the saved policy objects that you have that are assigned to a user or a device. We break it down to the CSP level, and then we dedupe everything. So that's where we get policy conflict discovery and things like that, is at the CSP level. So even if one's in a baseline for BitLocker and one's in settings catalog, we'll dedupe that at the CSP level before we send it down to the device. What that means is make sure you have the same values in both places. You could actually have multiple policies that have the same values, and they won't cause a conflict. We'll basically say, hey, it's coming from here, it's coming from here. Let's, this is the same thing, we'll just send it down. There are times, like I think for ASR rules right now, we'll actually merge it. So we'll say, hey, you have a list of devices here that are allowed, a list of the devices that are here that are allowed. We'll merge them together if they're both targeted. But at the CSP level, it doesn't make a difference to the device where it came from. And that's actually one of the hard parts about troubleshooting it, is if you look at the MDM report, we don't tell you what profile it came from. We just say, hey, this command got sent down over syncml. So I would say today, use endpoint security or settings catalog or baselines, and then over time, it'll get a little bit more clear. It's going to take us some time to fully realize that story of, do I want to use catalog, do I want to use templates, or do I want to use baselines? It's kind of there today, but they don't all create the same policy object, sort of like the image I had up before. But moving forward, that's what we want to do. So in the future, it'll say, I want to do BitLocker. It's, do I want to build my own thing because I know what all the BitLocker settings are, or I can use search and I'm comfortable doing that because I want to package it in with some other settings? Or do I just want to use the template? Or I don't even know where to start. I should use a baseline with recommendations, and a security baseline will have BitLocker recommendations in it.
Lots of good questions coming up here. Another question, in the administrative templates policy, the settings are filtered by user and devices, just like it is in GPO. And in the settings catalog, it does not appear to be. Does settings catalog not care if the settings are deployed to a user or a device?
Yeah, this is a weird one. I like this. So in a weird one, I mean, it's a weird answer that I like giving. So MDM can take either a CSP or a CSP node, or a setting can either have a device version or a user version. That ultimately determines whether it runs to HKey local machine if it's a device where it impacts all the users, or it writes to current user, so it only hits that one user. It's totally separate from how targeting is, right? So in GPO, if you have user policy, you can target it to a user unless you get into loopback and things like that. And you target your computer policy to computers, and that's kind of the way it's supposed to be, unless you get into loopback and all that fun stuff. In MDM, targeting is totally separate from how the policy is applied to device or user. So what happens is when that device checks in, it says, hey, this is my device ID, this is my user ID. It also says, here's my account ID, here's my client cert, all that stuff. It checks in and we go, okay, we took this combo, we found all the policy that was applied to both of these. Here's your superset. And if you have a user policy that's assigned to the device, or a device policy that's assigned to the user, it doesn't matter. We'll smush that all together and send it down to the device. So if you have there's kind of a table that I should probably work on getting out there in docs, where if you target device to a device, that's great. It'll hit anyone who uses that device. If you target user to user, that's great. It'll follow the user, whatever device they use, they'll get that setting. Those are more so customizations. From what I've seen in data, it's like 1 to 7. So for every 7 device-based policy settings, there's 1 user-based policy setting. In settings catalog, we'll denote that by putting user at the end of it if it's actually user-based. In the CSP, what that means is that URI is the one that uses like .vendor / user instead of device. Some of them default to device. I think the default is device. If both are supported, we'll show both settings as well, so you can pick and choose. If you deploy a user-based policy to a device, it'll work for all users who use that device. That's the most loopbacky like one. If you have a context for loopback, where you can deploy your user settings to a device and it'll hit all the users who use that device. And then you can do the weird one, which is you could deploy a device policy to a user. If that user logs into a machine, that will write to HKey local machine and then impact any other users who use the device. So the long answer is we don't care if it's deployed to a user or device. What I see in general practice is that for larger organizations and enterprise, people tend to prefer targeting to a device and then target their compliance policy to a user. And that way you can say, hey, this device, everyone who logs in gets the same experience instead of sort of tying it to the user.
Let's take one more, then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, when there's a conflict between an old custom setting and a catalog setting, what actually happens? Does the last applied setting win, or is this part of the dedupe that you were talking about earlier?
If they have the same value, I believe even if it's between custom setting and settings catalog, we will dedupe it. If it's a different value, we will mark it as a conflict. If a new device enrolls and there is a conflict present, we won't send the setting. If the device has had, so say that I've had a device that's been running for a year and it has this custom OMA URI setting on there, and then I add the settings catalog one and it's a conflict, it'll continue getting the custom setting until I remove that conflict, and then it'll let the new setting go. So if you did want to move, maybe this question is going to, because conflict to me really means that you have different values. If you have the same value, it's just a duplicate. Duplicates are totally safe. If you have a custom OMA policy and you create, so maybe this question is going to like, how do I migrate my OMA policy? You told me to migrate it. How do I do it? You could lay the same value down on both spots and then pull out the custom OMA one once your reporting is running and stuff like that for the settings catalog policy.
Got it.
Yeah. Trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to put out for awareness. The backport is coming for those settings. That's going to hit both ADMX and settings catalog administrative templates. When I say ADMX, I was meaning administrative templates. So those settings will start to apply. Ignite's coming up. Stay tuned for some more info. Keep using policy analytics. Give us feedback. We live on feedback. So if you have feedback, we do get if you send a frowny face, we read that in the Azure portal. So yeah. Any parting shots? Sounds like we're.
I don't have anything
We
It's been a great show.
+1 on an AGPM like solution.
Yeah. Yeah.
AGP,
Oh, the other thing I was going to
change
say, because
management was-
it came up in mail this week. Settings catalog is attached to the device configuration slider. I'll update docs, but it's good to know. We got a question on that.
Point. Yeah.
Um,
All right,
Yeah.
Steve, send us out since I've been having audio issues.
Sure. Well, Mike, this was awesome. We had lots of great questions, lots of good engagement from our attendees. And what I will do is I'll go back over the questions and make sure that we didn't miss any. If we did, we'll follow up on the archives. And again, don't forget to Danny actually posted this in the chat, but don't forget to go to aka.ms/unpacking endpoint management to view all previous archived episodes. And this one will be added soon as well if you want to spread the word to those who may have missed it. But again, this has been Unpacking Endpoint Management, episode 6 with Mike Danoski, and we just concluded a wonderful episode, very informative episode on the MEM settings catalog. Thank you,